Richard Kane had once been the kind of man whose very presence commanded attention. At 55, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had climbed to the top of the world and believed he would never come down. The newspapers called him a tech visionary. Forbes had listed him among the top 100 richest men in America. He owned 3 yachts, a collection of sports cars that gleamed like jewels in the California sun, and a glass penthouse perched high above downtown Los Angeles, from which he would sip his aged whiskey while looking down at the city like a king surveying his kingdom. To his employees, Richard was ruthless. Deadlines were absolute, mistakes were inexcusable, and loyalty was demanded but rarely rewarded. To his peers he was untouchable, a man who could turn any deal into gold. To strangers he was indifferent. If he noticed the man begging at the intersection, he would mutter that poverty is just a symptom of laziness, and instruct his driver to move faster. Richard believed money was not just power, it was proof of superiority. But on a hot August afternoon, all of that changed. It began with a single phone call. Richard had been in his office, glass walls reflecting the Los Angeles skyline, when his lawyer's voice cut through the air, trembling in a way Richard had never heard before. "Richard, the SEC just filed charges. They've frozen your accounts. Everything." At first Richard laughed. "Everything? Don't be ridiculous. I have offshore reserves, properties, trusts." But by evening the laughter died. His personal assistant resigned. His board members began deleting their names from company records. His so-called friends stopped answering calls. That night, his ex-wife sent a message through her attorney. Their children would not be seeing him for the foreseeable future. The following morning, Richard stepped into his penthouse lobby only to find strangers already packing his life into boxes. His credit cards declined. His accounts were inaccessible. The guards who once bowed to him now escorted him out with the cold professionalism reserved for criminals. By nightfall, Richard Kane, billionaire, tech mogul, untouchable king of Los Angeles, stood alone on a cracked sidewalk holding a leather briefcase with nothing inside it but a dead phone and a bottle of water. He thought it would be temporary. Surely the system would correct itself. Surely someone would step in to remind the world who he was. But the city did not stop. Cars still honked, lights still blinked, and people still hurried past him as if he were invisible. For the first time in decades, Richard realized he had no address, no access, and no one left to call. The arrogance that had carried him for years began to crack. He wandered the streets in his Italian suit, sweat staining the fabric, his polished shoes blistering his feet. He tried to hail a cab, but his card was declined. He tried to check into a hotel, but the receptionist eyed him suspiciously when the system flagged his name. He told himself he could endure a night without comfort, just one night, until everything returned to normal. But normal never came. That night, Richard found himself sitting on a park bench in MacArthur Park. The city smelled of exhaust and fried food drifting from street vendors. His stomach growled, but his pride refused to ask for help. A man shuffled past him, pushing a cart filled with bottles and cans. For a fleeting moment, Richard almost asked him where to find food. Instead, he pulled his suit tighter and stared at the lake shimmering under the dim streetlights. It was then, in the stillness of the night, that a thought struck him with terrifying clarity. What if this is permanent? What if I've lost everything not for a night but forever? The irony stung. Richard, who had once declared that the homeless were failures of ambition, was now indistinguishable from them. A passerby glanced at him, then quickly looked away. To them he was not a billionaire, not a genius, not a king. He was just another man on a bench, unshaven, sweating, out of place. The city that had once bowed before him now swallowed him whole, erasing his name, his reputation, his empire. And in that erasure lay the seed of a journey he could never have imagined. 30 days that would strip him bare, test his very will to survive, and ultimately teach him that the value of a man could not be measured in billions. Before the fall, Richard Kane's life was a carefully choreographed spectacle of success. Every morning began with the soft chime of a handcrafted Swiss clock in his penthouse bedroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows greeted him with a panoramic view of Los Angeles, a city he often referred to as his concrete empire. While the city below fought traffic and bills, Richard sipped coffee roasted exclusively for him in Guatemala, brewed by a private chef who knew the precise ratio of grounds to water. His wardrobe was no less curated. Tailored suits from Milan, each one costing more than most people's monthly rent. Richard enjoyed the way people's eyes lingered on the cut of his jacket or the shine of his shoes. He considered it a kind of armor, evidence that he belonged to a different class of human beings. Business was war, and Richard relished being the general. His company, Kane Technologies, dominated the market with software that powered everything from banks to hospitals. In boardrooms he was ruthless. Competitors were enemies to be crushed, employees were soldiers to be pushed to exhaustion, and clients were pawns to be manipulated. If someone dared challenge him, he would lean across the table, smile thinly and say, "You're either with me or beneath me." That attitude extended far beyond the office. Richard's social calendar glittered with charity galas and exclusive yacht parties, but generosity was never his motive. He donated millions not out of compassion, but because his name engraved on a marble wall meant immortality. He loved cameras, the flashbulbs painting him as both savior and genius. When asked about philanthropy he would chuckle, sip champagne and respond, "Money works harder than people ever will. My donations do more than any bleeding heart's good intentions." Privately he was even harsher. Waiters who mixed up his order earned scathing lectures. Chauffeurs who hit traffic were berated for wasting a titan's time. Once, after a young intern accidentally spilled coffee on his shoes, Richard forced the boy to kneel and polish them in front of the entire office. The memory always made Richard grin. Humiliation was, in his eyes, the most efficient teacher. Friends, if he had any, were transactional. He surrounded himself with men who admired his power and women who admired his wealth. Conversation rarely strayed beyond investments, acquisitions, or gossip about other elites. Richard prided himself on being above emotion. Love, loyalty, compassion. These were weaknesses in his philosophy, tools that the poor clung to because they lacked the intelligence to build real power. But perhaps his most defining arrogance revealed itself in the way he regarded the poor. Driving through Los Angeles, he often rolled his eyes at the clusters of tents on sidewalks. "Why don't they just get jobs?" he would mutter. "This city gives everyone a chance. They just squander it." His chauffeur once asked softly, "What if some of them never had a chance?" Richard's reply was sharp, cold, "Then they're not built for this world." This contempt became part of his identity. At dinners, he entertained guests with cruel jokes about panhandlers and food stamp programs. When protests erupted downtown about homelessness, Richard sneered at the television. "They should be thanking us for building the economy, not whining about scraps." The irony, of course, would later become unbearable. But in those golden years, Richard couldn't imagine his fortune ending. He had lawyers to guard his empire, accountants to hide his wealth, and politicians eager for his donations. To him, collapse was something that happened to other men, the careless, the foolish, the weak. At home, however, small cracks had already begun to show. His ex-wife, Julia, had once admired his ambition, but over time she grew weary of being treated as another accessory. Their divorce was bitter, public, and humiliating for her. For Richard it was just another deal. "She took the house in Aspen," he boasted to a friend, "but I kept the empire." His children drifted from him as they grew older, resenting the absence of warmth he could never provide. Richard excused their distance as immaturity. "They'll understand when they inherit billions," he told himself. Yet despite the glittering life, Richard was never content. Victory required fresh conquests. He built skyscrapers bearing his name, invested in projects simply to outshine rivals, and pushed his company toward increasingly risky ventures. Each success inflated his ego further, convincing him that he was untouchable, a modern king immune to fate. And then fate struck. When the SEC froze his accounts, Richard's arrogance had already ensured he had no allies. He had mocked too many, humiliated too many, alienated even his own family. The network of power he thought indestructible crumbled overnight. His friends whispered in boardrooms that they had seen it coming, distancing themselves as fast as they once clung to him. But Richard had yet to realize how poetic the irony was. He, the man who mocked the homeless, would soon stand in their shoes. He, the king of towers, would soon search for shelter under bridges. The world delights in irony, and Richard Kane was about to become its perfect lesson. The second night came harder than the first. By now, Richard's Italian suit had lost its sharpness, creased from hours of wandering. His once polished shoes were dulled, the leather stiff with sweat. The briefcase he clung to like a lifeline was empty, but he carried it anyway, as if the symbol of wealth could still shield him from the truth. He hadn't eaten in almost 48 hours. The hunger gnawed at him in waves, each one stronger than the last. In his old life, hunger was a word he associated with trendy fasting diets or skipping a lunch meeting because his schedule was too tight. But this hunger was different. It was primal, sharp, a roaring emptiness that made him dizzy as he walked the cracked sidewalks of Los Angeles. He approached a deli, its neon sign flickering against the night. For a moment he imagined stepping inside, ordering a steak sandwich and charging it to his platinum card. He reached into his pocket out of habit, only to remember the card was useless, frozen like his accounts. The reality stung. He pushed the door open anyway, swallowing his pride. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hot pastrami. His stomach growled audibly. The cashier, a teenager with acne and tired eyes, looked up as Richard hovered near the counter. "Can I help you, sir?" Richard hesitated, words catching in his throat. Finally he forced them out. I don't have any money. Could you, just a slice of bread maybe?" The boy stared at him, suspicious. To the cashier, Richard wasn't a billionaire in disguise. He was just another homeless man begging for scraps. "Sorry," the boy muttered. "We're not allowed to give food away." Richard's face burned with shame. Once he had dined in Michelin-starred restaurants where waiters bowed to him. Now he was being turned away for asking for bread. He backed out of the deli quickly, his pride screaming louder than his stomach. On the corner he spotted a trash bin behind the building. The smell hit him first: sour milk, rotting vegetables, stale grease. He froze, staring at it. No, he told himself. He wasn't that desperate. Not yet. He tightened his grip on the briefcase and walked on, but the hunger followed him like a shadow. By midnight he found himself near Skid Row. He had heard of it before, always in whispers, always as a place to avoid. Now the reality surrounded him. Tents lined the sidewalks, patched together from tarps and blankets. Smoke rose from makeshift fires in rusted barrels. People huddled in groups, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow yet watchful. Some muttered to themselves, others shouted at unseen enemies. The air smelled of sweat, urine, and despair. Richard froze, overwhelmed. He wanted to turn away, but his legs betrayed him, carrying him further into the labyrinth of misery. A man with tangled hair and a scarred face blocked his path. "You knew?" the man asked, eyes narrowing. "I'm just passing through," Richard stammered. The man smirked, showing broken teeth. "Ain't no one just passing through. You'll be back. They all come back." The words chilled him. He found a spot on the curb, away from the fires, and sat down. The concrete was cold, seeping into his bones. Around him, life on the street unfolded in rhythms he had never noticed from his penthouse. Deals were whispered in the shadows. A woman sang softly to a child wrapped in a blanket. A man argued with the air, his voice echoing into the night. Richard watched it all with the detached horror of someone who had stumbled into another world. Hours passed. His stomach twisted violently. At one point he saw a woman rifling through a trash bag and pulling out half-eaten sandwiches. She didn't hesitate. She devoured them as though they were treasures. Richard turned away, disgusted, not at her, but at himself for even considering doing the same. The night grew colder. His suit, once tailored for power meetings, offered little warmth. He tried to sleep, resting his head against the briefcase, but the city never slept. Sirens wailed in the distance, footsteps scuffed past him, and arguments broke out nearby. Every sound jolted him awake, his nerves raw with fear. Around 3 a.m. he felt a tap on his shoulder. He flinched, looking up to see an old woman with stringy gray hair. Her face was lined, her hands trembling as she held out a half-empty bottle of water. "You look worse than me," she said with a raspy laugh. "Drink. You'll need it." Richard stared, too stunned to speak. In his world, charity was a tax write-off. On the streets, it was survival. He accepted the bottle with shaking hands, whispering a thank you. She shuffled away before he could ask her name. As dawn broke, painting the city in pale light, Richard realized the truth. He was no longer a king in his glass tower. He was part of a world he had ignored, mocked, and despised. His hunger, his shame, his fear, they weren't temporary inconveniences. They were his new reality. For the first time, Richard Kane understood the weight of a truth he had once dismissed. Homelessness wasn't a choice and poverty wasn't laziness. It was a cage that swallowed people whole. And now he was trapped inside it. By his 3rd day on the streets, Richard's hunger had become unbearable. The gnawing pain in his stomach made it impossible to think clearly. Pride was no longer enough to silence it. He had lost track of time, wandering aimlessly through Los Angeles with his briefcase clutched like a relic from a past life. When he passed a fast food restaurant, the smell of fried chicken nearly broke him. He stood outside the window watching families laugh over trays of burgers and sodas. His reflection in the glass startled him. His once slicked hair was greasy and tangled. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. His tailored suit looked like a costume stolen from someone else's closet, filthy, wrinkled, and hopelessly out of place. Richard took a deep breath and stepped inside. The restaurant buzzed with noise, children shouting, trays clattering, the hiss of oil. He approached the counter, trying to straighten his posture, trying to summon the authority that had once made boardrooms tremble. The cashier, a young woman with a weary smile, greeted him. "Welcome to Chicken Shack. What can I get for you?" For a moment he almost said it. He almost ordered a meal as if his credit card would magically work again. Instead his voice cracked. I don't have money. But if I could just, maybe a small portion? Something you were going to throw away. The girl's smile faded. Behind her, a manager shook his head sharply. "Sir, if you don't have money you can't be here," the manager said firmly. Richard felt his cheeks burn. "I used to be a customer here. I used to." "Doesn't matter," the manager cut him off. "Please leave." The murmurs of other customers stabbed him like knives. He turned, humiliated, and stumbled back onto the street. For the first time in decades, Richard Kane had begged, and been denied. That night, desperation pushed him further. He waited until the same restaurant closed, then circled back to the dumpster behind it. The stench hit him immediately. He gagged, covering his mouth with a hand, but hunger overpowered disgust. He lifted the lid. Inside were bags of trash, leaking grease and sauce. His stomach churned as he spotted a half-eaten burger wrapped in paper. He froze. His mind screamed, "You're Richard Kane. You don't eat from garbage." But another voice, quieter and crueler, whispered, "You're not Richard Kane anymore. You're hungry." With shaking hands he pulled out the burger. The bread was soggy, the meat cold. He took a bite anyway. Shame washed over him with each chew, but so did relief. His body didn't care about pride, it cared about survival. The next morning Richard tried something new. He saw a man holding a cardboard sign at a busy intersection. "Hungry. Please help." Cars slowed and some drivers tossed coins or bills. Richard felt a spark of hope. It was humiliating, yes, but maybe it could work. He found an old pizza box in an alley and tore it into a rectangle. With a pen he borrowed from a passerby, he scrawled, "Lost everything. Need food." He stood on the corner, briefcase at his feet, holding the sign with trembling hands. Minutes crawled into hours. Most people ignored him, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Some glanced at him with pity, others with irritation. A few muttered cruel things, "Get a job," or "Another scammer." Finally, an older man in a pickup truck slowed down. He handed Richard a dollar bill through the window. "Good luck, buddy," he said before driving off. Richard stared at the bill in disbelief. It wasn't much, but it was something. He rushed into a corner store and bought a bottle of water and a pack of crackers. As he devoured them on the sidewalk, tears blurred his vision. Later that day Richard tried to find shelter. He remembered reading about missions and resource centers for the homeless, though he had always dismissed them as welfare traps. Now he followed the advice of another man on the street and walked to a church-run shelter downtown. The line stretched around the block. Men and women waited silently, their faces hardened by survival. Richard stood among them, clutching his briefcase, feeling utterly out of place. When he reached the entrance, a volunteer handed him a tray with soup, bread, and an apple. It was simple, but to Richard it tasted like the finest meal he'd ever eaten. That night he was given a thin mattress on the shelter floor. The room reeked of sweat and mildew. People coughed, muttered in their sleep, and shuffled restlessly. Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time he understood the crushing reality of dependence. Every bite of food, every roof over his head, it wasn't his to command anymore. It was something he had to accept humbly, sometimes beg for. The arrogance that once defined him was crumbling, piece by piece. And beneath it, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in decades: vulnerability. But survival demanded more than shame and hunger. If he wanted to last another day, he would need to learn the rules of this new world, rules written not in contracts or stock markets, but in the grit and desperation of the streets. And so began Richard Kane's education in humility, taught not in boardrooms but in alleys and shelters. For weeks, Alex found himself walking through a fog. He woke up in the penthouse overlooking Central Park, his sheets Egyptian cotton, his coffee brewed by a personal chef, his meetings scheduled by a team of assistants. And yet, he felt like a ghost wandering through someone else's life. The first crack came in the middle of a gala. A billionaire's gala, the kind where crystal chandeliers reflected like 1,000 diamonds and violins played as if to soothe the guilt of wealth. Alex was sitting at a round table, dressed in a custom Armani tuxedo. Around him, people talked about hedge funds, art investments, and new ways to save on taxes. But across the ballroom, Alex's eyes fixed on a waiter, young, maybe 19, balancing a tray of champagne flutes. The boy's shoes were scuffed, his white shirt slightly frayed. His smile looked practiced, the kind that hides exhaustion. For a second their eyes met. The waiter's gaze flickered with something Alex hadn't seen in a long time: hunger. Not just for food but for survival, for a chance. And in that instant Alex saw himself. Not the billionaire persona, not the polished CEO, but the boy who once mopped floors at a gas station for minimum wage. His chest tightened. He excused himself from the table, ignoring the puzzled looks, and stepped outside into the cold Manhattan air. The second crack came days later at a board meeting. His executives presented quarterly reports filled with record-breaking profits. The company had crushed smaller competitors, expanded into markets where labor was cheap and regulations looser. Applause filled the sleek glass conference room. But Alex couldn't bring himself to clap. He kept seeing the faces behind those numbers. The single mother who emailed him once, begging not to be laid off when their plant closed. The factory worker in Vietnam who made sneakers for less than $2 a day. The small-town shopkeepers bankrupted when his corporation moved in. The walls of the conference room seemed to close in. Applause turned into static in his ears. He stood abruptly, muttering about needing air, and walked out. The third crack came quietly in the privacy of his penthouse. He sat alone one night, a half-drunk glass of whiskey on the marble counter, the city glittering outside like a million tiny temptations. He scrolled through social media. There, in a shaky video filmed on a cracked phone, was a former co-worker from his earliest job at a grocery store. The man was grayer, heavier, but unmistakable. He was standing outside the now-shuttered store, holding a cardboard sign: "Lost my job after 30 years. Need work. Will do anything." Alex's throat burned. This was the man who once covered for him when Alex was late to a shift. The man who taught him how to stock produce faster, who shared sandwiches with him during breaks. And now, decades later, Alex was worth billions, and that man was begging strangers for work on a street corner. The guilt was no longer avoidable. It was suffocating. For the first time in his career, Alex couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m., asking questions he had buried for years. What was it all for? The money, the status, the empire? Who had he become in the process of becoming rich? The next morning, Alex sat at the long oak table in his penthouse dining room. Breakfast was laid out: croissants, smoked salmon, fresh orange juice, but he didn't touch it. His chef hovered nervously, unsure what to do. Finally, Alex spoke. "Tell me something," he said, his voice raw. "What would you do if you had my money?" The chef blinked, startled. "Sir? No, really. What would you do?" The man hesitated, then answered quietly, "I'd send my daughter to college. She wants to be a doctor, but we can't afford it." Alex stared at him for a long time. A lifetime of wealth suddenly felt like a prison, not a privilege. And that was the breaking point. Something inside Alex shifted that day. He realized he couldn't go back. Not to the hollow galas, not to the boardrooms filled with applause, not to the empire built on the backs of people like that waiter, that factory worker, that old friend holding a cardboard sign. If he kept going, he would drown in his own fortune. So he made a decision. He didn't know exactly what it meant yet, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity: the life he had built was killing him, and he had to tear it down before it consumed him completely. The morning after his breaking point, Alex woke before sunrise. The city outside his penthouse windows was still asleep, skyscrapers reduced to dark silhouettes against a pale orange sky. For the first time in years he didn't check his phone. No emails. No stock tickers. No news alerts. Instead he sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. His chest felt strangely light, as if the decision forming inside him had already lifted a burden he didn't realize he was carrying. By 7 o'clock, his phone was buzzing relentlessly. Assistants, investors, lawyers, all demanding his attention. He silenced it. Then he did something radical. He walked into the office 2 hours late without telling anyone. When he entered the glass tower bearing his company's name, the reaction was instant. Assistants rushed toward him with clipboards, offering schedules, contracts, reminders. He waved them off and walked straight into the boardroom. The meeting was already underway. 20 men and women in tailored suits turned their heads as Alex pushed open the heavy doors. Charts filled the screens: profit margins, quarterly gains, projections for expansion into new territories. The CEO, the one Alex had groomed to run operations, paused mid-sentence, visibly rattled. Alex didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table and looked at each of them. "I want to ask you something," he said. His voice was calm but carried weight. When was the last time any of you spoke to the people who make this company possible? The warehouse workers, the janitors, the delivery drivers, the people stitching shoes, packing boxes, manning cash registers. The room was silent. Someone cleared their throat. That's not really one executive began. It is our job, Alex cut him off. It always was. He turned off the projector, plunging the glossy boardroom into awkward silence. For a moment he felt like a stranger in his own empire. These were the people he had chosen to surround himself with, and now, looking at them, he realized they weren't leaders. They were mirrors reflecting back the very worst version of himself. I built this company to climb out of poverty, Alex said. But somewhere along the way I forgot why. I became obsessed with numbers, expansion, control. And in the process I became the thing I swore I'd never be. The COO, a sharp woman in her 40s, raised an eyebrow. Alex, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying I'm done, Alex replied. Gasps broke around the table. You can't just. You're the face of this company. This will tank the stock. Alex held up a hand. Calm down. I'm not abandoning the company. But I refuse to keep running it the way we have. If we're going to continue, it has to be different. Fair wages. Real benefits. Investments in communities instead of just shareholders. Or I walk away, and I take my stake with me. The board erupted into chaos. Some shouted about fiduciary duty. Others muttered about betrayal. But Alex felt oddly at peace. For the first time in decades he wasn't chasing more, he was drawing a line. Later that day, Alex went to see someone he hadn't spoken to in years, his mother. She still lived in the same modest house in Queens, the one with peeling paint and a garden of stubborn roses. When she opened the door, her face lit up with surprise. Alex? You didn't call. I know, he said, hugging her tightly. I needed to be here. They sat at the kitchen table, the smell of coffee filling the room. It felt like stepping back into another life. His mother listened quietly as Alex told her about the gala, the boardroom, the man with the cardboard sign. Finally, she placed her hand on his. Mijo, you always wanted to escape poverty. And you did. But escaping doesn't mean forgetting. Maybe now it's time to remember where you came from, and who you are. Her words struck deeper than any stock market crash. That night, Alex returned to his penthouse and opened a blank notebook. For hours he wrote, not numbers, not strategies, but names. The names of people he had met on the way up. The gas station clerk who gave him extra shifts, the high school teacher who believed in him, the old coworker begging for work. Each name was a reminder of the debt he owed. When the sun rose, he closed the notebook. On the cover, he wrote 2 words, the plan. It wasn't about running from his empire. It was about transforming it, before it destroyed him and everyone else it touched. For the first time in his life, Alex wasn't thinking about profits or market share. He was thinking about redemption. And redemption, he realized, would be the hardest climb of all. The following week was unlike anything Alex had ever faced in his career. The day after his fiery declaration in the boardroom, newspapers ran headlines that read, Tech Titan turns socialist? Is Alexander Kane losing his mind? Boardroom meltdown shakes empire. Talk shows mocked him. Financial analysts speculated about early-onset dementia. Stock tickers flashed red. Billions were wiped off his company's valuation overnight. But Alex didn't flinch. For the first time in years, the numbers didn't scare him. What scared him was the realization that his empire had been built on sand, on fragile perceptions, on ruthless exploitation, on systems he no longer believed in. He called an emergency press conference. Cameras crowded the room, lenses pointed at him like rifles. Executives watched nervously from the sidelines, their smiles rehearsed but their eyes full of suspicion. Alex adjusted the microphone. I know you've all heard the rumors. Yes, I said what I said. And no, I'm not going back on it. This company will no longer operate like a machine that chews people up and spits them out. We're going to raise wages, restructure executive bonuses, and start investing in the people who've been invisible for too long. A reporter shouted, Mr. Kane, are you admitting your company exploited workers? Yes, Alex said bluntly. The room gasped. And I was complicit. But I refused to let it continue. The press conference ignited a firestorm. Social media exploded. Some praised him as a visionary. Others called him a traitor to capitalism. Hashtags trended for days. Hashtag Kane gone crazy versus hashtag Kane revolution. But behind the public spectacle, the real battle was brewing inside his company. The board convened an emergency meeting without him. Lawyers drafted documents. Investors whispered about ousting him. Even his COO, the one who had once been his most loyal lieutenant, met with shareholders behind closed doors. "Alex," she said later in his office, her tone sharp but measured, "you can't just change the rules overnight. You'll bankrupt us. You'll destroy everything we've built." "What we built," Alex corrected, "wasn't sustainable. You know it." "I know it." She folded her arms. "Do you really think you can fight Wall Street? The hedge funds? The shareholders who will sue you the second profits dip? You'll be eaten alive." Alex leaned back in his chair. For a moment, doubt flickered. Could he? Or was this madness? That night, he walked through the city streets without his usual entourage. He passed a homeless encampment under the bridge, the same spot where he had first spoken to the man with the cardboard sign. The man was gone. His place taken by another, a young woman cradling a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. The sight pierced him. He crouched down and offered her the sandwich he had just bought. She looked up, startled. Recognition flashed across her face. "You're Alex Kane, the billionaire." "Not tonight," he said softly. "Tonight I'm just someone who cares." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "People like you don't care about people like us." "I'm trying to change that," he replied. The baby stirred and the woman rocked him gently. "Then don't just talk. Do something. Because speeches don't keep us warm." Her words cut deep. He had made grand declarations, but declarations weren't enough. Change wasn't press conferences or boardroom ultimatums, it was action. Visible, tangible action. The next morning, Alex ordered the company to open a pilot program, converting one of their vacant office buildings into a shelter with job training facilities. The idea was radical, untested, and expensive. The board revolted. Executives stormed into his office with spreadsheets showing losses, graphs predicting collapse. Investors threatened lawsuits. The media called it a stunt. But Alex pressed forward. When the first families moved into the converted shelter, cameras showed up again. Some called it a publicity ploy, but the families didn't care. To them it was a roof over their heads, food on their plates, and a chance to start over. That night, Alex visited the shelter himself. He sat with a group of teenagers playing cards on a worn table. They didn't treat him like a billionaire. They treated him like a stranger, maybe even a nuisance, until one asked, "Why are you here? You're rich. You don't need this." Alex smiled faintly. "Because I forgot what it meant to be human. And I'm trying to remember." The room fell quiet. For the first time in years, Alex felt seen, not as a mogul, not as a symbol, but as a man trying to make amends. But outside the shelter, storm clouds gathered. Investors prepared their knives. Politicians called him dangerous. And the COO, his once loyal partner, was already plotting a move that could end his reign forever. Alex had taken his first bold step toward freedom. But freedom always came at a cost. The shelter's opening should have been a triumph. For Alex, it was proof that words could become action. For the families who moved in, it was a lifeline. But inside the glass towers of Manhattan, it was a declaration of war. By the second week, the company's stock price had plummeted 20%. Headlines screamed disaster. Kane's experiment bleeding billions. Wall Street turns against billionaire idealist. Rebellion in the boardroom. Alex sat in his office, staring at the tickers scrolling across his computer screen. The old Alex would have panicked, scrambling to reassure investors. But this Alex? He closed the window and picked up his notebook labeled The Plan. That was when his COO, Evelyn Shaw, walked in. Tall, impeccably dressed, her every movement radiated precision. She had been with him for 15 years, rising from assistant to right-hand strategist. He had once called her his business soulmate. But her expression was colder than he'd ever seen. "Alex, we need to talk." He gestured to the chair across from him. She didn't sit. "The shareholders are furious. We're bleeding money. Lawsuits are piling up. Do you understand what you're doing to us?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," Alex said evenly. "I'm saving us from ourselves." Her lips tightened. "No. You're destroying everything we built. And I can't let you." He blinked, startled. "Evelyn, what are you saying?" She set a folder on his desk. Inside were documents. A motion to remove him as chairman, signatures from the majority of the board, and a petition from top shareholders. "We're voting you out," she said, her voice flat. "Effective immediately." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Alex stared at the papers, unable to process. Evelyn, his Evelyn, leading a coup against him? "You were supposed to be on my side," he whispered. "I was on your side," she replied. "Until you lost your mind." You want to play savior? Fine. But not with my career. Not with this company. Anger flared. This isn't about your career, Evelyn. It's about people's lives. Her eyes hardened. And this company is about profit. That's the deal we made when we entered this world. You knew that. You thrived on it. Don't act like you're suddenly too pure for the game. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then Alex closed the folder and pushed it back toward her. Do what you have to do, he said quietly. But remember this, the game we played created everything wrong in this city. And one day you'll see it too. Evelyn didn't flinch. She turned and walked out, heels clicking against the marble floor like a gavel hammering a verdict. The boardroom vote happened the next day. Cameras weren't allowed, but leaks spread like wildfire. Executives lined up to cast their ballots. Alex sat at the end of the table, expression unreadable, while Evelyn presided with ruthless efficiency. When the count was finished, the verdict was clear. Alex Kane was removed as chairman and stripped of direct control over his company. He walked out of the building to a mob of reporters. Flashbulbs exploded in his face. Questions flew like bullets. Mr. Kane, how do you feel about being ousted? Do you regret your decisions? Is this the end of the Kane empire? Alex paused on the steps, the weight of the world pressing down on him. For a second he considered silence. But then he spoke. You can take away my title. You can strip my power. But you can't take away my conscience. And I promise you, this is not the end. The crowd roared. Some cheered. Some jeered. But every camera captured his defiance. That night, Alex returned to his penthouse. For the first time it felt empty, not a sanctuary but a gilded cage. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, looking down at the city lights. His empire was gone. His allies had turned. His reputation was shredded. But as he thought of the families in the shelter, of the young mother rocking her baby, of the man with the cardboard sign, he felt a flicker of something Evelyn couldn't strip from him. Conviction. If anything, her betrayal had freed him. Without the chains of shareholders and boards, he could finally act on his own terms. He set down the glass, picked up his notebook and wrote 3 words beneath the plan. Start from nothing. For the first time in decades, Alex Kane was no longer a billionaire. He was something else entirely, something more dangerous to the system than money ever made him. He was a man with nothing left to lose. The morning after his ousting, Alex woke up not to alarms or urgent calls but to silence. No assistants waiting with schedules. No drivers idling downstairs. Just him in a penthouse that suddenly felt like an echo chamber of a past life. He brewed his own coffee, burning it slightly, and laughed at how foreign the simple act felt. He had once joked he didn't even know where his kitchen was. Now he stood in it, barefoot, realizing how much of his own life he'd delegated away. The news was relentless. Every network, every podcast, every headline dissected his downfall. Some commentators gleefully declared him finished. Others framed him as a tragic cautionary tale. A few, though, spoke of him as a man brave enough to defy the system, even if it cost him everything. Alex turned off the television. Enough noise. He needed action. That afternoon he left the penthouse and walked through the streets of Queens, the neighborhood where he had grown up. Gone were the chauffeurs and security details. He wore an old hoodie, jeans and sneakers. For the first time in decades, nobody recognized him. He was just another face in the crowd. He stopped at the bodega where he used to buy cheap sandwiches after school. The same man, older now, stood behind the counter. Alex ordered a ham and cheese and paid cash. The man didn't even glance twice. As he bit into the sandwich, Alex felt something he hadn't in years: connection. Not to luxury but to reality. He wandered further, past a community center with a faded sign, Helping Hands Outreach. The building looked tired, but through the windows he saw volunteers sorting food donations. Something drew him inside. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached him. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'd like to volunteer," Alex replied before he could second-guess himself. She hesitated. "We can always use more hands. Have you done this kind of work before?" "Not exactly," he admitted. "But I'm a fast learner." She smiled faintly and handed him a box of canned goods. "Then let's start here." For the next few hours, Alex stacked shelves, carried boxes, and listened. He listened to volunteers trading stories about their struggles. He listened to families who came in for food, single parents, elderly neighbors, kids with tired eyes. No stock tickers. No boardroom jargon. Just real people with real needs. As the day wound down, one of the teenagers helping out, a lanky boy with restless energy, looked at Alex curiously. "You're not from around here, are you?" "I grew up a few blocks away," Alex said. The boy smirked. "Yeah, but you don't look like us. Your hands are too soft." Alex chuckled. "You'd be surprised how quickly they toughen up." The boy shrugged. "Whatever. Thanks for helping, I guess. Most people don't care." Alex almost told him who he was, but he stopped himself. For once, anonymity felt liberating. He wasn't Alex Kane, billionaire. He was just Alex, the guy carrying boxes. That night, exhausted and sore, Alex sat on the curb outside the center, watching the sun set behind the city skyline. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to money. But reality hit him. His fortune was shrinking fast. With the board freezing his assets and lawsuits circling, he had maybe weeks before his personal wealth collapsed. If he wanted to keep fighting, he couldn't do it alone. The next day, Alex reached out quietly to a few trusted figures. Not billionaires, not executives, but people he respected from the world outside his empire. A former teacher who had once believed in him. A journalist known for exposing corruption. A young activist fighting for housing rights. They gathered in his penthouse, sitting awkwardly on designer furniture that felt out of place with their worn jackets and notebooks. "Why us?" the teacher asked. "Because I don't trust anyone else," Alex said simply. "I'm not here to save anyone. I'm here to help build something different. And I can't do it alone." The journalist leaned forward. "You realize the system will crush you, right? They'll ruin you. Maybe worse." "Then let them try," Alex replied. "I've already lost everything they can take." The room fell silent. Slowly, one by one, they nodded. As the group began sketching ideas late into the night, Alex felt a surge of energy. They weren't talking about profits or markets. They were talking about shelters, community programs, cooperative businesses, ways to rebuild from the ground up. For the first time, Alex wasn't leading a board. He was part of a movement. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The empire he had lost was nothing compared to the one he was about to build, not for himself, but for the people who had been invisible for too long. The billionaire had fallen. But in the ashes of his old life, something new was rising. The launch of neural net horizons was more than just a business event. It was a spectacle. Broadcasted live across the world, cameras panned across glowing skyscrapers draped in banners of Orion Tech. The crowd of journalists, investors, and tech enthusiasts buzzed with anticipation as Ethan Kane strode onto the stage. He wore his usual understated gray suit, but his presence commanded the room like a general unveiling a new weapon. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady yet charged, "what you're about to witness isn't just the future of technology, it's the future of humanity." The screen behind him came alive, displaying visuals of sleek headsets, brainwave scanners, and images of humans seamlessly interacting with machines. Ethan explained how neural net horizons could enhance memory, accelerate learning, and even treat cognitive disorders. His words painted a future of limitless potential. The audience erupted in applause. But as Ethan stood there, basking in the spotlight, shadows loomed. In the front row sat his estranged brother, Michael, whose company Pulseware had been struggling since Ethan's aggressive acquisitions. Michael's arms were crossed, his jaw tight. For him, the launch wasn't progress, it was a declaration of war. That night, the headlines were ecstatic. Ethan Kane unveils tech that could change humanity forever. The company's stock skyrocketed. Investors celebrated. Governments lined up to strike partnerships. Ethan's empire had reached a new apex. Yet behind the numbers and the glamour, cracks began to show. Employees at Orion Tech whispered about exhaustion, about the ruthless demands of perfection Ethan placed on every project. "He doesn't just want results," one lead engineer muttered to a colleague over coffee, "he wants miracles, every single day." Burnouts, resignations, and even breakdowns became more common, hidden from public view but felt deeply within the walls of the company. Ethan, however, refused to acknowledge the toll. His ambition burned hotter than ever. Each success only raised the stakes. He started attending fewer family dinners, missing birthdays, and canceling personal plans. Even Sophia, his once closest confidant and head of public relations, noticed the distance. "You're chasing something you can't hold," she told him one evening in his glass-walled office. This obsession with being the one who changes everything, it's costing you." Ethan barely looked up from the glowing streams of code on his monitor. "History doesn't remember those who stopped halfway, Sophia. It only remembers those who finish." The first major ethical backlash came a month after the launch. A leaked video showed Orion Tech testing its neural devices on volunteers who hadn't fully understood the risks. One subject trembled uncontrollably, his speech slurred, his body convulsing as scientists scrambled to stabilize him. The footage spread online like wildfire. Hashtags like #EthicsOverEmpire and #NeuralNetNightmare trended overnight. News outlets questioned whether Ethan's empire had grown too powerful too fast. Is Ethan Kane playing God? One op-ed blared. Protesters gathered outside Orion headquarters with signs reading "Humans aren't experiments" and "Stop Kane before it's too late." Ethan's response was characteristically unapologetic. At a press conference, he dismissed the backlash as fear of progress. Innovation, he said firmly, is never without risk. Humanity's greatest leaps have always been built on the courage to try. What you see as danger, I see as destiny. The statement polarized the world. To his supporters, Ethan was a visionary refusing to bow to outdated morality. To his critics, he was a tyrant blinded by ambition. Meanwhile, Michael seized the moment. Appearing on talk shows and podcasts, he cast himself as the voice of reason. What my brother is doing, Michael warned, is reckless. Technology this powerful must be approached with caution. Otherwise, the consequences could be catastrophic. The media loved the narrative. Two brothers, once close, now standing on opposite sides of a technological revolution. The Kane rivalry became a trending topic. Ethan as the bold pioneer. Michael as the cautionary skeptic. Every soundbite fueled the fire. But while Michael gained sympathy, Ethan gained more power. Governments desperate not to fall behind in the tech race continued to sign deals with Orion. Neural net horizons spread like wildfire, first among elites who saw it as a status symbol, then among corporations, schools, and even militaries. The world was changing faster than anyone could grasp, and at the center of it all was Ethan Kane. Yet late at night, when the applause faded and the cameras turned off, Ethan found himself alone in his penthouse, staring out at the glittering city skyline. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the ice clinking like a metronome. The silence pressed down on him, heavier than any criticism. For a fleeting moment he remembered the boy he once was, the boy tinkering with scraps in a garage, dreaming of building something that mattered. Somewhere along the line he wondered, had the dream turned into an empire too vast to control? His phone buzzed with a message from his mother, "We miss you. Come home." Ethan set the phone face down, untouched. He whispered to himself as though justifying it, "There's no going back now." The world saw a titan. But behind the glass, Ethan Kane was just a man, caught in the unrelenting grip of his own ambition. And ambition always demanded a price. The first signs of collapse weren't explosive. They crept in like hairline cracks on a mirror, barely noticeable at first, but impossible to ignore once they spread. It began with whispers of corruption inside Orion Tech. An anonymous whistleblower leaked thousands of internal documents to the press, revealing how the company had fast-tracked neural net approvals by lobbying regulators with questionable payments and lavish consultations. Headlines screamed, "Kane's empire built on bribery? Whistleblower exposes Orion Tech's dark side." The revelation sent shockwaves across Wall Street. Orion stock plummeted. Investors who had once worshipped Ethan as a visionary scrambled to distance themselves. Class action lawsuits flooded in, alleging consumer deception, data abuse, even human rights violations. Ethan, however, stood defiant. In a televised interview, he leaned forward in his chair, his jaw set. "This isn't about truth. This is about fear. They're afraid of progress, afraid of what we've created. But I promise you this, no storm will sink us." His words inspired diehard supporters, but to critics they sounded delusional, even dangerous. Then came the blackout. One humid summer night, in a major U.S. city where neural net horizons had become widespread, thousands of users reported simultaneous system failures. Brainwave devices shut down mid-use, leaving some people in catatonic states, others suffering seizures. Hospitals overflowed. Chaos spilled into the streets. News footage captured desperate families pleading for answers. Parents screamed at doctors to revive their children. Protesters clashed with police outside Orion headquarters, chanting, "Shut it down! Shut it down!" The government had no choice but to intervene. Hearings were announced. Federal investigators raided Orion offices. Ethan was subpoenaed to testify before Congress. The day of the hearing, America tuned in. Ethan walked into the chamber, flanked by lawyers in dark suits, the cameras clicking like machine guns. On live television, senators grilled him about safety protocols, ethical breaches, and the blackout that left hundreds injured. "Mr. Kane," one senator pressed, his voice sharp, How do you justify releasing a product capable of shutting down human minds without adequate safeguards? Ethan adjusted his tie, eyes unflinching. With respect, Senator, you don't halt the invention of the airplane because of turbulence. Humanity cannot advance without risk. The senator shot back. Risk is one thing, recklessness is another. And right now the American people see you as reckless. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Clips of the exchange dominated the evening news. For the first time, Ethan Kane looked less like a pioneer, and more like a liability. Behind the scenes, the fractures in Ethan's empire widened. Executives resigned en masse. Partners canceled contracts. Sophia, the loyal PR chief who had stood by him for years, handed in her resignation. Her parting words cut deeper than any headline. You wanted to change the world, Ethan. But somewhere along the way you forgot it's people, not machines, that make the world worth saving. Michael, his brother, capitalized on the chaos. Appearing on CNN, he delivered a scathing critique. I warned him. I told him that unchecked ambition would lead here. My brother isn't a villain. He's a man who lost sight of humanity. And now we're all paying the price. The media ate it up. Ethan became a symbol, not of genius, but of hubris. But Ethan wasn't ready to surrender. Alone in his penthouse, surrounded by glowing screens filled with graphs and code, he plotted a comeback. He believed if he could fix the system flaw and launch a safer upgrade, he could silence the critics, restore trust, and reclaim his throne. He worked obsessively day and night, refusing to sleep. His health deteriorated. He drank coffee until his hands shook. His reflection in the glass grew gaunt, haunted. Still he pressed on, telling himself, they'll thank me when this is over. They'll see I was right. But even as he coded feverishly, federal agents were circling. Court orders loomed. His board prepared to oust him. The empire he had built, stone by stone, deal by deal, was crumbling beneath his feet. One stormy evening, as lightning split the sky outside his window, Ethan finally cracked. He slammed his fist against the desk, sending a mug shattering to the floor. His voice echoed against the empty walls. I gave them everything. I gave them the future, and they throw me away like trash. He sank into his chair, head in his hands. For the first time in years, Ethan Kane felt something he had long buried: doubt. Was this truly progress, or was it destruction disguised as innovation? The man once hailed as the modern-day Edison, the titan who bent entire industries to his will, was now cornered, alone. And the world watched, hungry for his fall. The morning of the board's emergency meeting arrived under a gray, heavy sky. Manhattan's skyline looked bruised, half-shrouded in fog as Ethan Kane's town car pulled up to Orion Tech headquarters. He had been ousted in everything but name. His seat as CEO was little more than a formality now. Inside the gleaming tower he once called his kingdom, shareholders and directors gathered, ready to decide his fate. Ethan's reflection in the elevator doors was almost unrecognizable, pale, hollow-eyed, his once carefully tailored suits hanging looser on his frame. For decades, he had worn armor in the form of confidence. Today there was only a man bracing for judgment. The boardroom was ice-cold with tension. 17 directors sat at the long polished table, their faces grim. Michael, his estranged brother, had been invited as a consultant. He avoided Ethan's gaze, his jaw tight. The chairman spoke first. Mr. Kane, the numbers are catastrophic. Stock is down 70%. Public trust is gone. Governments are threatening bans. You've become the story, and not in a way this company can survive. We're voting to remove you. The words should have shattered him, but Ethan remained still. He had expected this. Yet, as the board members prepared their votes, he did something no one anticipated. He stood. Before you decide, he began, his voice lower than usual but carrying a strange clarity, I need to say something, not for this room but for history. Every camera in the room, hidden or otherwise, tilted toward him. He confessed. Ethan spoke of the shortcuts he had taken, the risks he had ignored, the arrogance that had convinced him he alone knew the path forward. He admitted that neural net horizons had been rushed, that warnings from engineers had been buried, that safety had been sacrificed for scale. I told myself it was for humanity, he said, his eyes scanning the room. But if I'm honest, it was for me. For the empire, the legacy, the need to be untouchable. I thought I was building a future, but I was really building a monument to my ego. Silence pressed down on the boardroom. Ethan turned then, not to the directors but to his brother. Michael, you warned me. You begged me to slow down. And I called you small-minded. I was wrong. Michael's eyes softened, the first crack in years of resentment. News of the confession spread within hours. Clips went viral. Ethan Kane, the untouchable titan, admitting his sins. Some saw it as a hollow performance, an attempt at damage control. Others saw a man finally stripped bare of power and pride. But the board still voted. Unanimously, Ethan was removed. Security escorted him from the building. The cameras outside flashed like lightning, reporters shouting questions he no longer answered. For the first time in his life, he didn't fight for the microphone. He walked away quietly, a fallen king disappearing into the crowd. Weeks passed. Orion Tech limped forward under new leadership, but NeuralNet Horizons was suspended indefinitely. Regulators tightened oversight on emerging tech. Families affected by the blackout filed suits that would take years to resolve. And Ethan? He vanished from public life. He rented a small, unfurnished apartment in Queens under an alias. No assistants, no private chefs, no chauffeurs, just him, a bed and a desk. Every morning he walked through ordinary streets unnoticed. For the first time he heard the hum of a neighborhood waking up. Kids shouting on their way to school, vendors arguing over prices, dogs barking at delivery trucks. It was life stripped of spectacle, and it unsettled him more than any Senate hearing ever had. One evening, while grocery shopping, he saw a man on the sidewalk hunched under a tattered blanket. A cardboard sign read, "Veteran. Hungry. Anything helps." The man's eyes met Ethan's, tired, resigned, yet somehow familiar. Ethan froze. Memories surged of his 30 days as a homeless man years ago, when he had disguised himself as an experiment. Back then, it had been temporary, a stunt to understand the human condition. He had always known he could return to his penthouse at the end. But this man had no penthouse to return to. No safety net. Only the cold pavement. Ethan knelt, handed him the groceries and whispered, "I'm sorry." The veteran looked confused but nodded slowly as if forgiveness didn't matter, only survival. That night, Ethan sat at his desk and opened an old notebook he hadn't touched in years. Not to design a new empire. Not to map out profits or IPOs. Instead, he began sketching ideas for shelters powered by renewable energy, programs to train the homeless in tech skills, safe networks built not for profit but for dignity. For the first time, his pen moved not with ambition but with humility. Years later, a journalist tracked him down for a follow-up story. The once feared billionaire now wore second-hand clothes, his hair streaked with gray. He declined to speak on record, but the journalist noted something striking. Ethan Kane doesn't look like a man plotting his return. He looks like a man who finally understands the cost of his rise, and is trying quietly to pay it back. In the end, Ethan Kane's name never regained its shine. History books would remember him as both a genius and a cautionary tale. A man who reached too high, fell too far, and finally chose a different kind of legacy. Not one of dominance, but of atonement. And perhaps that was enough.